So what we've done in the last two lectures is look at multiple methods to split the overhead up between multiple products. So in our factory we manufactured two or more products. In our case we're going to use an example of a factory that manufactures skateboards and scooters. And what we're going to do is we're looking for ways to divide up the cost of the overhead between both of these products. We've looked at two methods so far. One was basically called the traditional costing method, and one was called the departmental costing method. Now we're going to look at an activity-based costing method. So activity-based costing, or ABC, works well when we have a situation where we have a more complicated manufacturing process with many activities that are all important in making the product. So maybe you have your purchasing department, and then it comes and it's shipped in, and you have material, moving the material around, and then you have fabrication, and you have parts assembly, and then you have packaging and all those things. So you have a lot of different activities going on, and each of those activities are very different from each other, and there's no overriding activity that would be the best cost driver for every one of those activities. So maybe in each of these activities you don't have a cost driver that really works well for the entire factory. And each of these jobs will note that they use the activities to a different extent. Let's take the skateboard. Let's say it uses a lot more of the fabrication activity than the scooter. So we're going to look and focus in on that activity by itself and giving overhead for that part of the process. So to do the activity-based costing method, it's very similar to the departmental overhead rate method. Basically, it's the same type of calculation. It's just all you'll have to do is change the words department to the word activity and then apply the method. So let's go ahead and look at a cleared out spreadsheet. So it's going to be very similar. First we need to find the activities that are associated with manufacturing in our plant. So we'll list out all the activities that management thinks are key activities in manufacturing for the skateboard and scooter. So the key managers have identified, let's see, about 6 activities. And these that they believe are the key activities to the manufacturing process for skateboard and scooters. There's the setup, then there's the raw material requisition, then the activity is the fabrication of parts, and then we have factory supervisors. Then we need to inspect the finished goods, and then we package them. It's worth noting here that these activities were determined by our management team, but a different management team might come up with different activities. For our purposes, we're going to stick with these activities. The next thing we want to do is pool the cost together, just like we did with the departmental. So this time, instead of having departmental cost pool, we're going to have the activity cost pool. So we'll have the cost pool, or the pooling together of all the overhead costs in each of these activities. Now we want to determine our cost drivers. The cost drivers for each of these activities are going to be what we use for our formula for our allocation base. In other words, the bottom part of our formulas. So we're going to have, if you notice, a rate for each of these activities. So we're going to have 6 different rates that we're going to apply. So each activity has a different cost driver, meaning a cause and effect relationship. So the number of times we set up is going to be one of the cost drivers. The more parts we use, that's going to be our next cost driver, the number of parts. Fabricating costs are based on the use of machine hours, so the MH is for machine hours. For supervisors, we decided to use the cost driver as the direct labor hours. And then we have the inspections. We decided to go with the number of inspections, and then for final packagings, the number of cubic feet in the packaging area. Now, again, it's important to notice that these cost drivers, the number of setups, the number of parts, the number of machine hours, etc., those cost drivers were determined by our current management team. However, different management teams might determine that a different cost driver would be a better fit. Since you have multiple options for cost drivers, having a management team that truly understands the process usually leads to a better allocation of the cost in the end. So let's go ahead and divide the cost pool by the allocation base. By dividing the cost pool by the allocation base, we get the activity overhead rate. We get a different activity overhead rate for each activity. So every time we set up for the skateboards, $10 of overhead goes to the skateboards. Every time we spend an hour on direct labor hours for the scooters, $3 goes for the supervisory overhead, goes to the scooters, and on and on. So then the next thing we do is we want to go ahead and drop down to the second parts, and we're going to apply these rates. So again, these rates would be determined at the beginning of the year and then used throughout the year, or at least for a significant amount of time. And then every time we did a job, we would apply these same rates. We have a job for skateboards 101 and scooters 102, and we're going to see how much for each of these activities we use to make each of these jobs. So the next thing to do is take whatever is here and just drop it down to here. So the question is, how many setups did we have for job 101? So you have to find that information out. It would have to be provided for you. How many setups did we have for job 102 for the scooters? Looks like we had to do 2 setups for the skateboards. The rate is $10 per setup, and so we are going to give $20 of overhead to job 101 because of that. And there's 4 setups, so we give $40 of overhead for job 102. So then we'll do the same thing. We'll ask ourselves, well, how many parts did we use on job 101? Because that's going to determine how much overhead we give to the material requisition activity. We use 20 parts at 50 cents a part. That means $10 of overhead. $13 for the scooters because we use more parts. For fabrication of parts, we want to know how many machine hours, because that's the rate we have. So how many machine hours? So we'll get that information. We used 1 machine hour for the skateboards and 4 for the scooters. So more machine hours at $24 an hour means more overhead, $96 for the scooters. For factory supervisors, we look at how many direct labor hours that were associated with each. So there were 9 direct labor hours to manufacture the skateboards, so they're going to get overhead based on 9 hours versus the scooters, which was 6. Now the rate is $3 per hour, so that comes to $27 in overhead for 101 versus 18 for job 102. There are more inspections for the scooters, 6 versus 3 for the skateboards. The rate is $5 of overhead for every inspection. And then the final packaging area is based on the amount of space for the packaging. Turns out we need a little bit more cubic feet of space for packaging the scooters. So at the rate of 25 cents per cubic foot, that means there's going to be a little bit more overhead applied to the scooters. So now that we have looked at each of the activities, we can add them up. We see the total overhead for the skateboards at 140 versus the scooters at 212. Let's compare this to the other cost allocation methods for overhead. So we see that these 3 methods end up resulting in different amounts of overhead applied to each of our products. Again, this doesn't mean that one method is going to lead to less overhead being used in the factory. It just means that less of the overhead used in the factory gets applied to one job versus the other. And it doesn't mean that means that by going with the cheapest one, we're saving money in any way. It just really means that we're looking for the allocation method that best reflects the true nature of the product. Which product is really sucking up a lot of the overhead? The methods do not change the direct materials or the direct labor. The direct materials and direct labor are the same. Remember, direct materials and direct labor are specifically and directly associated with each product. So these different methods that we looked at in these lectures was really about how we're going to split up the overhead costs, because those are much more challenging to split up. When management determines that one of the allocation methods, either traditional or departmental or activity-based costing, is the most effective for their factory, then they get some benefits out of that. First of all, they get the benefit of better pricing and understanding how they should, what kind of product mix they should have. So they get better information to make better management decisions. They get better information to help them cut costs. Even though determining which method to use doesn't directly and specifically lead to savings right away, it leads to better understanding of the manufacturing process and the cost associated with manufacturing, so that decisions can be made in the future to be more efficient in that plant. And it helps for better planning and control of the manufacturing process. The bottom line is that the benefits of having an effective cost allocation system for your overhead to each of your multiple products results in better understanding of the cost by management. And that results in better cost allocation, in other words, dividing up the cost of overhead between the different products. And then that results in better management decisions, determining the pricing of the products and which product mix you should go with. And that will lead to a competitive advantage for the organization.